Kevin McCauley, MD, graduated from Drexel University Medical School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1992. He entered the United States Navy and received his naval flight surgeon training at the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute in Pensacola, Florida. He was a flight surgeon for a Heavy Marine Helicopter Squadron 363 at Marine Corps Air Station, Tustin, California, and for Marine Fighter Attack Training Squadron 101 at Marine Corps Air Station, El Toro, California. From 2009 to 2013, Dr. McCauley was the director of Lamont, a sober living recovery management program in Sandy, Utah, and was president of the Utah Association of Recovery Residences. He is currently the director of program services at New Roads Behavioral Health in Salt Lake City, Utah. As co-founder of the Institute for Addiction Study, Dr. McCauley wrote and directed 2 films, Pleasure Unwoven, about the neuroscience of addiction, and Memo to Self, about recovery management in commercial airline pilots and professionals with substance use disorders. Pleasure Unknown won the 2010 Michael Q. Ford Award for Journalism from the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. Dr. McCauley, he's got a rough life, travels between Utah and his home in Honolulu, Hawaii, where he lives with his wife, Christine. So really, it's a great pleasure. And Dr. McCauley's been here before. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Gosh, it's like coming home, seeing so many friendly faces and old friends. And somewhere along the line in early 2000s, I got a job at Southern California Drug and Alcohol Programs. And I went around with a little tripod and a dry erase marker board, and they had a number of programs all over Los Angeles County. And I would just, talk about the neuroscience of addiction. I was on probation. I was just fragilely sober myself. I was being paid minimum wage, but I was very happy that I was no longer in jail. And I recognize this amazing thing, which I know all of you know, is that people who are in recovery, people who need recovery, people who love others who need recovery, they're just so fascinated to know that there are reasons behind the seemingly inexplicable behavior of addiction. And I can remember it was just down the street here in Long Beach. Angel Step, I think, was the name of the house. And I went there, and I remember I got there, and the women who lived in the house were a little late because they had been to the dentist. And I was sitting there with my little tripod and my little dry erase board ready to go, and they came in, and they'd just been to the dentist, and they were looking at each other's smiles, and they were just so happy that they could smile. And you see stuff like that, and it leaves you changed. You're not the same person. And I think we all know this, is that this field is like the one area of healthcare where you just see amazing things, deeply moving things, affecting things every single day. And to me, I for the last 2 decades, I've been trying to make this information about the neuroscience of addiction accessible, and having the pleasure of watching the lights come on in people who are in a family program or in a detox or something like that. And who made that possible was you. I mean, you listened to me. You actually allowed me to come to your programs and sit there and listen to this guy who, and I'm sure you can see the arc of my own recovery, because I'm no longer showing pictures of copulating animals in my slide deck here. But as I've gotten more and more sober, I've become a little bit more circumspect, a little bit more mature. But I really, in many ways, this life I completely owe to you. I think it was 2004 when I was last in this room, and I've lectured at TIAC, and I've lectured at your programs, and I coming back here is like coming home, and I'm so grateful to you for your support over all those years, and thank you again for bringing me out to talk about my favorite subject, which is the subject of the neuroscience of addiction and how it explains this very, very difficult experience that people go through, and obviously I would want this information to be as accessible as possible. So as we go along here, I got tons of slides. Maybe we'll get to all of them, maybe we won't, but please feel free to ask questions. That's actually kind of what I'm trying to do. A good lecture for me is when I put a few slides up and then people start raising their hands and we kind of get a discussion going back and forth. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the neuroscience, but also talk about some things that I think are interesting about this subject. And if you would like these slides, I can send you the exact deck. This is my email. This is also the website of the second film that we made, Memo to Self, and a lot of the material that I'm going to cover is on there too. If you'd like any of the journal articles that I'm going to be quoting from, I'd be more than happy to send those to you as well. And I'm getting a lot of emails on a daily basis, but I try very hard to get to all of them. But if you ever have a question, if someone stumps you, definitely email me, because I like that client. I like the client who folds their arm and says, "Oh, this isn't a disease, that's a bunch of garbage." That's my favorite kind of person. So if anyone ever tells you something, you're like, "Wow, I never thought of that," call me or write me or something like that. And you can reach me through these two the website and the email. Lately I've been just kind of trying to anchor the lectures, start the lectures by having people remember their last pleasurable experience, because that's really the system in the brain that starts to go wrong at the very, very core of addiction. Again, when I was just starting out, I think this was like 1999 or 2000. It was just before 9/11. I went on a trip. My probation officer at the Orange County Probation Department allowed me to go on a trip with my mother. My mother's a fly fisher woman. She loves to go to this one dude ranch in Montana. And so we went up there, and I don't fly fish. I just, kind of looked at the mountains and stuff. And this particular dude ranch was very popular among judges. Sandra Day O'Connor was there one year when we were there. And when the sun goes down, there's really not a lot to do. You can't fly fish. And so people kind of, they read or they play chess or they kind of sit around the dining room table and talk. And I was doing that, and I was talking with this Superior Court judge. I don't know which state he was from. And they had made this really good dessert, this really good peach cobbler. And I remember I was talking with this judge about addiction, and this was right around the time that Robert Downey Jr. had gone to prison for his addiction, and today, one of the greatest recovery stories. But back then, not so sure. And I can remember this judge, very cynical, saying, I can't believe that someone would do that they would take all that talent and all that opportunity and just throw it away for drugs. I mean, you're never going to be able to explain that to me, no matter how much you try. And right as he said that, he reached out for a second bowl of peach cobbler. And his wife was sitting next to him, and she kind of put her hand out. She said, "Oh, you're trying to lose some weight." And he goes, "You know what? I'm on vacation, okay? If I want to have a second piece of dessert, I'll have a second piece of dessert, okay?" So he starts shoveling it into his mouth and saying, "All right, well, McCauley, you say you study addiction, so what is it that you study?" And I say, "I study that right there, which you just did, which everyone has an experience of a momentary failure and a prior commitment to not do something that is pleasurable. Take that moment that everybody knows, well, anybody that we would care to know knows, and turn it up 1,000%. And that's addiction, or at least you're starting to get close. And so we have to think about, how does the brain do this thing which is so basic to our existence? How does it construct a pleasurable experience? When you put a piece of delicious chocolate cake in your mouth and you say yum, all right, what is happening in the brain? Well, there's a whole bunch of systems that are working together. First of all, the most basic, it tastes good, all right? Chocolate tastes good, and that's not to be argued with. There's also an element of survival involved. If you eat chocolate cake, you're going to live another day. You're not going to die of starvation. So at some point, those very, very ancient survival mechanisms come into all of this, right? It's not just about tasting good. Every time we have a pleasurable experience, especially a notable one, the brain lays down a memory of it. It puts it, it's like a photograph, right? And the things that went along with that pleasurable experience at that moment become part of it. So the people that we were with, the sights and smells of the moment, the sound of the balloons bouncing against each other, even the time of day, even the angle of the sun in the sky, they become part of that memory. Okay? And that memory of this particular piece of chocolate cake will now be compared to all previous pieces of chocolate cake. I don't know about you, but I know exactly where I was when I had the most delicious piece of chocolate cake of my life. All right? That is just a memory that is never going to go away. And also, part of that memory, part of that experience, part of that yum, are the emotions that go with it, all right? If this is a piece of chocolate cake that I made with my grandmother, that's going to be a very, very different piece of chocolate cake than the kind that I buy, at the 7-Eleven, all right? Not only that, these pleasurable experiences can start to take on their own separate meaning. So the yum of chocolate cake can be something that you enjoy or that you feel guilty about, right? You might even avoid it, right? If you're trying to stay healthy, trying to stay on your diet. And all of these things come together. All these different systems in the brain coalesce, and they drive our choice to have a second piece of chocolate cake or not, right? And this is the system so basic to human existence is the system that breaks. And so as you've heard me say many times before, addiction is a broken pleasure sense. We can call it a hedonic dysfunction. You can call it a problem in the dopamine system, which it is, although that's a little misleading because dopamine is just the first in what's going to be a cascade of chemicals, what we call the hedonic cascade. Dopamine is just the first one. But if I break my dopamine system, something goes wrong with my dopamine system, it ruins my ability to do two things. One is predict what is valuable in the future, and the other is predict what's likely in the future. So every future value calculation I make also has a probability calculation in it. And if that goes wrong, that undermines my ability to make choices. And then I think the particularly cruel part of addiction is not only is my decision-making impaired, but I can't see it. As the disease progresses, the disease of addiction progresses, right, I lose insight into just how impaired my decision-making is. And so if I had to summarize addiction in just those two simple sentences, it would be addiction's a disorder of pleasure that very quickly becomes a disorder in volition. And that is a very, very big idea. The idea that value or aesthetics is connected to pleasure, the idea that aesthetics or pleasure is connected to volition, to choice, that's a very big idea that could keep philosophers busy for the next 50 to 100 years. And that's what this neuroscience allows us to do. It allows us to deconstruct these things which we've taken for granted, but if they go wrong, well, we all see the result of that every day. And now the rest of the country is too. Many of the things that we've been talking about, that we've been meeting about, that we've been studying for these past decades are now coming to fruition because the country is in desperate trouble. And all that we've learned and accumulated and studied is now, I think, very topical. All right, people in the past, when I first started doing these lectures, people would, I would go anywhere. I think I went to like ITT Technical Center one time. SCADP sent me in there to just do a lecture on addiction. And people would just like be fascinated because they wanted to hear about the drugs and the trip to Leavenworth and all the other things that I'd gone through and a little bit of neuroscience in there. And they were fascinated because it was just such a horrible, shocking story and that I'd be willing to talk about it, right? Now people are absolutely rapt because they need to be. They're desperate to understand what's going on in their own family. So if someone wanted to learn about addiction, if someone came to me and said, I'd like to know more about addiction, what should I study? This would be the first thing that I would have them read. Don't bother reading this slide. It's a very busy slide. This is just my one-paragraph summation of the 8-page document, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine's definition of addiction. Fabulous document. It would be the first thing that I would go to. All I'm trying to kind of point out in this slide is that we have multiple systems failing. When the hedonic system fails and volition fails right behind that, we have at least 5 different systems in the brain that are failing at the same time. And I think this is one of the reasons why it took us so long to figure addiction out. It's just so complex compared to other diseases, right? But one of the points that I tried to make in the first film, Pleasure Unwoven, was that you have these systems that are they start very small, but as you get more and more layers, as each brain system comes after that, all right, you essentially have things going wrong sequentially. So we have to start out, in mechanisms that exist even before the brain does. And then when the brain does exist, we have to go right down to the very, very most basic reward processing deep in the brain. So we have to figure out, what's going wrong there. Very quickly, learning and memory systems become part of this. There are 2 books going around right now, fine books. One written by Maia Slavitz, a very important, I think, voice in journalism of addiction. Another by a brilliant Canadian neuroscientist. Fabulous writer, lyrical writer, and they're both making the argument that addiction is not a disease, that it's really better conceived of as a learning disorder. It's more like autism or ADHD or something like that. It's something that you pass through. You don't really, recover from anything because you're just merely going through a suboptimal phase in your life and getting better from it. And if addiction only involved this system, I think that statement would be true. But it doesn't. It involves more systems. So we have to take into account how habit and memory and learning fit into this. But then we have to go beyond that. If you want to pick one cause for addiction and be on very firm ground, and the evidence just keeps pouring in about this, pick that one. Addiction really seems to be a defect in the stress response that then breaks the dopamine system. And these systems just build one problem after another, after another, after another, until finally we find ourselves in the areas of the brain which really do the things that we have taken for granted, that we didn't really think were part of a disease process, like making choices, right? So again, if you look at the ASAM definition, they go to some pains to show that addiction is more than just dopamine. It's more than just the neurochemistry of reward. We really have to look at some of the things that are going on in the frontal cortex, which are systems that are very, very much dependent upon those earlier systems. And if things go wrong here, then things are going to go wrong up here. The processing in the cortex is only as good as the information that arrives from below, right? And so the ASAM definition wants to point out the behavioral, the cognitive, and the emotional, important, the emotional aspects of addiction. This is essentially just a rewriting of the symptoms that we're familiar with. If you remember the DSM-4, if you're up on the DSM-5, these are the things that we see, the narrowing of the behavioral repertoire. The things that the person used to love to do, like be on the softball team or go to Thanksgiving at mom's house, those things, as they start to compete with the drug, they're just dropped. And the person increasingly is just focused on the procurement, use, and then recovery from the drug. The cognitive changes, and these are very, very fascinating. The fact that people will deny things right in front of their face. They simply cannot see it, these skewed beliefs, and that is largely because the information that's arriving in the areas of the brain that do these calculations, like calculate value, especially future value, are disturbed. And I think we're seeing a lot more usefulness in the mindfulness-based therapies, things like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, because they really help this aspect of addiction, which overlaps other brain disorders that involve a failure of emotional regulation, right? We know that addiction is a relapsing disease, that not everybody has to relapse, but it does seem to be a phenomenon, and there are 3 basic reasons that we can take from early neuroscience studies of laboratory animals that trigger relapse: exposure to rewarding substances, exposure to things that went along with those rewarding substances, and then emotional stressors especially that are poorly managed. this aspect of self-deception is particularly fascinating, and I think one of the things that make this particularly difficult is that this self-deception fades. There are sometimes I don't have it, there are other times that I do. The idea that volition is almost like lungs, it's breathing. Sometimes I have it, sometimes it fails, sometimes it comes back, and that can happen several times throughout the day. That's hard, I think, for the average person to get their head around, because we just think of choice as just something that we have and we need to use it, and if we don't, we're bad. ASAM wanted to focus on these symptoms, but I really don't see any conflict between the ASAM symptoms and the DSM-5 symptoms. They all kind of look the same to me, with to me the most important symptom being that obsessional, ruminative, aversive brain state where the person simply cannot stop thinking about the drug. And I think that most of the arguments that I hear against the idea that addiction is a disease, they boil down to an inability to really appreciate the suffering of craving. And that's what I've tried hard to do over the last 20 years, is to really kind of capture, as if it can be captured into words, what that experience is like. The second thing that I would have a person read if they wanted to learn more about addiction would, of course, be the Surgeon General's report. We didn't have this, now we do. It's a wonderful thing. It's a very solid compendium of not only the neuroscience, but a number of really all the good research. It takes me about 2 days to get through this thing, so it's a bigger project. But everything that I'm going to talk about here today fits well with the model that the Surgeon General's report embraced. There has been some griping about the particular model, specifically Nora Volkoff and George Koob's model of how addiction is really a staged process where the person goes from an initial binge intoxication stage to where what's motivating taking of the drug is the good feelings, the rewarding feelings that drugs have. But as a person continues to do that, other areas of the brain take over. The system essentially switches to another area of the brain, and now drug taking is motivated more by the misery of not drug taking, right? And then as that process takes hold, then other areas of the brain, more up in the frontal cortex, take over, that solidify the drug taking, that essentially change that person's appreciation of the world, their thought processes, to make sure that the addiction doesn't stop, that the drug taking continues, right? And so we're going to be talking about all of these. Nothing that I'm going to say here today disagrees with in any way what's laid out in the Surgeon General's report. I'm just going to take it a little bit in a few different directions. And again, I think the interesting thing about this is what finally happens in the frontal cortex. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, good. All right. So if you have, please feel free to speak up. So one of the things that has always perplexed me about this question is the fact that choice can seem to vary. When I first heard this particular scenario, it was from Tom Horvath, who I think he might still be the president of Smart Recovery, but he runs a very fine program down in La Jolla. And this is why I call this Horvath's dilemma. Those of you who've seen my films, you know it. Addiction's not a disease because people can, with the right motivation, choose not to use drugs. If you put a bottle of alcohol in front of an alcoholic and they reach for it because they're powerless, they can't help themselves, you can get them to not drink. You just pull out your gun, point it at their head, and say, okay, well, how about now? And most people faced with a gun to the head will be able to mobilize the free will to choose not to use. And as I made points in the film, you can't really do that with a disease like diabetes. There's no way to use punishment to stop a real disease with real symptoms. It won't work. But there's something about addiction that you can. And when I first heard Horvath's dilemma from Tom, that's it. It's over. It just seems so airtight. And I think that this is a thing about the argument against addiction being a disease. On an intuitive level, it just makes so much sense. It has just strong appeal on that level. And those of you who are familiar with my movies, I finally figured it out, which is, okay, yes, you can get the person not to take the drugs, but you can't get them, even with a gun to their head, not to crave. And it's really the craving that is the more important measure of the addiction. So there's a point at which you don't actually have to have drug use anymore. There's something that changes in the brain that is separate from the intoxication. And I think that if you were to go back and look at the Surgeon General's report, it would be this part that happens right here, right? We thought we were using punishment to stop, getting high, but actually it was much, much more complex. And that there's a point at which, the drugs can be very much in the distance. The person can be sober or at least absent for a long time, but there's still a problem going on in their interpersonal functioning, their emotional regulation. So this is probably the gentleman who's got the best argument against calling addiction a disease, Gene Heyman. He's written a book called Addiction is a Disease of Choice, a statement that on the face of it I absolutely agree with. I do believe that addiction is a disease of choice. He's trying to say that these people really are choosing to have the disease. And one of the things that he's pointing out is the fact that most people with serious addictions like intravenous heroin addiction over time just get better. They stop. And this is, the famous maturing out argument. I'll just as a quick aside here, I'm in the process of trying to reapply for my California medical license, which is very unpleasant and a very shame-inducing process, but I've got people working with me as I go through it. I remember the day that they took my license away. I was in the Camp Pendleton brig in solitary confinement, and the door would open and I had no idea what was going on. I just some new horror was coming my way. And so the door opened up and they said, "McCauley, come out here, you're going to a hearing." I'm like, okay, and they shackle me up and they take me to this tiny little room with this chair, table, phone, that's it. They shackle me to the table and I wait there for the next hour. And a lot of waiting in jail, those of you who've been. And the phone rings and it's this, and it's a hearing essentially to take my medical license away. And on the other end of the phone is this Deputy Attorney General. And he says, so we're going to have a hearing here in a few minutes, and we're going to try and have an emergency revocation of your license. And I'm like, great. And so the administrative law judge comes on, and everybody's sworn in, and I'm holding the phone, even though I'm shackled to my ear, trying desperately to listen as my career is flushed down the toilet. And the judge says, okay, Mr. Ladendorf, present your case. And he's like, this is Dr. McCauley. He's got a drug addiction problem. He's been court-martialed by the Marine Corps. He's going to prison. He doesn't think he has a problem. He doesn't admit powerlessness. This guy, we want his license right now. And the judge says, they're sending you to prison, Dr. McCauley? And I'm like, well, I am guilty, after all. And he's like, well, do you have anything to say for yourself? And I said, well, Your Honor, I don't disagree with the facts of Mr. Ladendorf's statement. What I would ask you is, please give me a chance to get some treatment. I mean, I do think I'm powerless. I mean, the evidence of my powerlessness of my addiction is all around me. I would ask you if I could at a later date, show you that I can get into recovery, I would be grateful. And he said, well, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to put your license in abeyance, and when you get through that, and I think that's ridiculous that they're sending you to prison, but when you get through that, you appear before me and let's see what we can't do. And so he hung up, and I think Mr. Ladendorf, the Deputy Attorney General, was moved, actually. I was just something on a paper, but then he heard me speak. And so we talked. And he said, well, I'll tell you, I've been dealing with addiction for a long time, especially in physicians. And this is what it comes down to. It's a matter of maturity. And, once people kind of grow up, they stop using drugs. And I think once you grow up, you're going to be fine. And I can remember sitting there just thinking, well, isn't that convenient, right? None of that research on addiction needed to be done. Nor can just stop. All those journal articles, they can be thrown away because really the secret was with you. All anybody needed to do was come to you, cop, and ask you what the secret was. But I'll be honest, I did not say that. I've never been able to shake what he said. Never. And so I think that there is something, that I would take issue with this word mature, but yes, I do think that a lot of what made me vulnerable to addiction was a at least, and I'm speaking just for myself, a sort of immaturity. I like to use the sort of immunological understanding of the word. When I was born, I had an immature immune system, and then I got a bunch of vaccines and illnesses, and now I have a mature immune system. And I think that that's more the way I see it, is that as a person gets those resiliencies, they enter a more mature state, and then, yes, their addiction can go away on its own. And that's what Heyman is trying to point out. Most people with addiction get better on their own. They don't need to go to AA, they don't need treatment, they just, over time, stop. And so that 18-year-old who's shooting heroin, by the time he's in his mid-30s, and he's no longer hanging around the friends who use drugs, and some of the normal, responsibilities of adulthood have fallen upon that person, they just kind of stop. And it's hard to argue with that, because it does seem to be that there's a lot of evidence to show that. And he quotes, and a number of other folks quote, these studies that show that there really is a remission rate that accumulates with time. It's a little different for different drugs, but most people get better on their own. Now, the other thing that Heyman is quoting in his book is research from the NESARC, the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcoholism and Related Conditions. And what NESARC has shown, and NESARC is a big study attached to the census. And so it's done every 8 years. And now they have, I think, 3 or 4 waves of data. But when he wrote his book, it was only 3. And what they noticed is that people who were asked if they had an intravenous heroin problem at time 0, 8 years later, fewer did, and 16 years later, almost no one did, right? And so there does seem to be this spontaneous remission that happens over time, and that's the argument that Heyman is trying to use. Once things change and once the punishment gets bad enough, people stop. Now, here's the problem. How did they, in NESARC, how did they assess how the people who were using heroin at time 0 were using it at time 1, 8 years later, and time 2, 16 years later? They asked them. Can you see the problem there? I don't know all the ways that my addiction continues to play itself out in my life, right? And so I think it's very, very difficult to say, especially without toxicologic proof, drug tests, that anything is really going on that they think it is. I don't think anyone knows what's really happening with these people. And until we have that toxicologic evidence, until we really take that broader view of addiction, I think many of the statements about addiction, people just mature out, are problematic. Yes, ma'am?
Do those curves take into account the deaths that occur?
Yeah, see, this is the argument that goes back, most people get better by the time they're in their mid-30s is not going to help the parents who are desperately trying to save the life of their 18-year-old addicted kid. And so, no, those would be dropouts in these studies. And I think that's the problem. That is what this opioid epidemic has given us. It has recast many of these debates in a very new light. The legalization debate is completely different once the DEA starts finding carfentanil in seized heroin samples. Suddenly, the idea that all drugs should be legal just looks stupid, because these are potent toxins. They are lethal. They are practically chemical weapons. The Russians have weaponized fentanyl. Did you know that? Yeah. You remember that hostage crisis in Moscow, the theater, where the Chechen separatists took all those people? When the federal police stormed the theater, they gassed it, and all kinds of people died. Half the hostages died. It was gaseous fentanyl. They couldn't get naloxone to those people fast enough, right? And so I think that's what had not happened yet when Heyman wrote his book, was the opioid epidemic peaking. And suddenly you're like, oh my God, there really are addictions that can kill a person very, very early on in the game. And so, yeah, the whole maturing out thing just is a completely different argument once you realize that people will die before they can, have the decency to mature out. But we can't, we can't ignore these studies, though. They really do show that there are different trajectories, different pathways in and out of addiction. So Dr. Sir here at UCLA has been following this very interesting group, this cohort of heroin-addicted patients who've been followed for many decades now. And there does seem to be this pattern where some folks kind of come into the study very severely but get better over time, right? So those would be your matures out. Some people stay the same, some people get a little worse. And what's interesting in Dr. Sear's studies is that they all kind of fall into this pattern. Some people start out bad, get better. Some people start out bad, stay bad. Some people start out not so bad, get worse. Some people kind of, have this low level for the, duration. Some people get better almost immediately. And it holds not just for heroin, but also for methamphetamine and for cannabis. So this is a pattern that I think, is the basis of the whole life course approach to really any chronic disease, but especially to addiction, is that some people, yes, will get better on their own. What about the people who die? What about the people who don't get better? They get worse over time. And I think it's wonderful that some people, based on little things, get better. But just because one group of patients with the disease gets better on their own doesn't mean that another group of patients won't need a lot more help. And I think what's happening here is that these are small changes in that person's otherwise quite privileged life, right? I'd like to know what the racial breakdown here is, right? What is the socioeconomic breakdown? How many of these people were incarcerated at an early stage in their life? How many of them were exposed to adverse childhood experiences? Let's control for that. And then I think that this whole maturing out thing becomes a little bit more complex. But these arguments come up. There's Heyman's, there's Mark Lewis's, the Canadian neuroscientist. There's a very fine journalist on TED these days talking about the famous Rat Park study. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I think that what I try to do is I try to be as up on these arguments as possible and see if they, withstand greater scrutiny. And like I said, it's been a long time since anyone's been able to stump me. So I think all of these raise very, very good points. But this, there are these, and some of them are coming out in rather high-level journals, people saying, oh, everything we know about addiction is wrong, everything's being rewritten. And I got to tell you, that's just factually untrue, right? If we thought that addiction was a disease and then something came out, some study, something that we hadn't thought of, and we turned on a dime and said, oh my God, you're right, we hadn't thought of that, addiction's not a disease, that would be the first time in the history of science that anything like that had happened. It's not going to happen, all right? This is very solid foundational neuroscience. It's not going to turn around. And what you're looking at is sniping on the edges, which is important. People should raise these arguments. There are lots of things that we thought were true or no longer, that we realize are no longer true. But I really don't believe that we have anything to worry about when it comes to whether or not addiction's a disease. Did I see another hand go up or no? Okay, so let me, oh yes ma'am. Where did I go for treatment? That's a really good question. No one's ever asked me that. I loved my treatment experience. I had a wonderful time. I stayed 4 months. I went to a little program that no longer exists in East San Diego County called Rancho La Brea. And it was run by a child psychiatrist from Texas by the name of John Milner. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful place. And it was a very standard, traditional, no-frills introduction to 12-step based abstinence recovery. And that's what was, I think, right for me. I don't think that that's right for everybody, but I'm just glad that I got that introduction. No one was on methadone who had a medical license back then, that's for sure, not for addiction. So, I mean, I went there because the Medical Board of California said, you will go here, right? And I wish I had a magic wand and I could give everyone that experience, because it framed everything to, that came after that. And then I came up here and I met, all of you. And like I said, you were extremely kind to me at a time when I was extremely obnoxious. But yeah, I didn't get anything fancy. I went right down the middle when it came to my own treatment. So again, those of you who are familiar with the first movie, I won't take a lot of time on this. The basic argument for addiction being a disease is this. This is our definition of disease in medicine. Doesn't look like much, but that really is everything that we do. Everything in that hospital across the street revolves around this, all right? And when doctors chose this, about 100 years ago, it was easy to see how diseases in fairly straightforward organs and diseases with relatively straightforward causation could fit this model, right? It was not as easy to see how things like mental illness could fit the model. And when doctors couldn't really fit addiction to this very materialistic, very reductionist definition of disease, they said, well, then it must not be a disease. And that was really the turning point. If you were to go back and look at things written by doctors 120 years ago, not 100, but 120 years ago, they're amazingly humane, broad-minded statements about how these are patients and they suffer and they need to be defended. And then all of that changed. And it changed because when doctors sort of absorbed this model, when they decided this is the model we're going to choose to design modern medicine around, addiction didn't fit. And that was inconvenient for addiction, so these patients were suddenly not patients anymore, right? If we could figure out, the organ, the defect, the symptoms, then addiction would fit this model, and we can do that. We can do that so we feel very comfortable that we know the areas of the brain, that we know the basic defect. Yes, it's a little complex, but it takes some time and it fits together quite nicely. And the symptoms that we see, especially the fourth one, impaired decision-making plus loss of insight, right? Now it's very clear that there's a mechanism. That doesn't get us out of the woods, though, right? A lot of my complaints against my first film have said that it's a straw man hypothesis, that I'm essentially putting up this bad definition of disease and then showing how addiction fits it and then knocking it down. But no, that's just the beginning of the problem, because here's the thing, the disease model itself, yes, has its problems. Oh, sure, it's driven modern medicine, and it wouldn't surprise me if a helicopter flies over us and lands on a helicopter pad, or someone's being taken right now to the cardiac cath lab across the street. But that is a form of medicine that is designed around this model that has its own problems, and not the least of which is that it really is highly reductive, very, very materialistic. And so when people say, oh, the solution to the opioid crisis, the solution to the problem of misprescribing these prescription opioids is really the prescribing of this prescription opioid. Sorry, we got it wrong. Those are bad, this one's good, right? That is to the extent that MAT works and saves lives, it should be used. I'm not disagreeing with that. But do you see the problem? It's still falling into this materialistic definition of disease. We have this belief that either a pill or a surgery will fix this problem, and pills and surgeries really don't fix any medical problem. We have to look at the context, right? And so this is what all of primary care is trying to do. We're trying to, we're good at acute disease. We need to get better at chronic disease, which really looks at things like, what are the community-based support mechanisms out there for a person with diabetes, or a person with, or a child with asthma, right? Is there something that could support people in early recovery? And of course, there is. And so when we move to a chronic disease model, we threaten the dominant paradigm, because a lot of these things don't necessarily need to be delivered by experts or cost a lot of money. But I think in the long run, they're much more helpful. So, okay, I'm open a little bit to the straw man hypothesis. I think part of what's confused us here is that I've been talking about, what has confused me is that I've been talking about a disease model, and really what we need to think of is more of a public health model, which can take into account all the causal power of the disease model, but it can address things like spiritual context and faith and how the family fits in, and why things like some people mature out and others don't, right? And so I think that would be the argument that I would make, but we still have this extremely fascinating idea of a disease of choice, a disease of volition. And most of the trouble that I see in the arguments around against the idea that addiction's a disease is that they fundamentally refuse to believe that choice can become part of a disease process. And so in many ways, what I'm trying to do in my lectures is not make a teleologic argument, which we sometimes make, those of us who work in this industry. It works better when we call addiction a disease. More people come to treatment, they feel less shame. We get paid, that's important, right? I don't care what it does. Well, I do, but I don't. If addiction's a disease, I'm asking an ontologic argument. Could a disease of volition exist? Is that something that is even possible in the natural world? And I can't come up with any scientific reason why not. And so that's, I think, what's folks are choking on, is that we just have a really, really hard time understanding that something that we consider so basic to the human experience as our capacity to make choices can become part of a disease process. Yes, ma'am?
We see this in depression
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety.
Right.
People can't cross the street even though they would choose it, or they can't get out of bed even though they would choose
You're absolutely right. So there are lots of diseases that involve failure of volition, but we just have refused to apply that to this particular group of patients. And so eventually I think what happens is you just fall into prejudice. There's just a non-rational refusal to accept that these people deserve any sympathy as patients. There's a disease called diabetes insipidus, not diabetes mellitus. Diabetes means thirst. And so these are patients who have a hormonal problem in their brain where they're just desperately, desperately thirsty. And you have to fluid restrict them. They can't drink. And these patients will drink water out of toilets. They will escape from their hospital room. They will, do just about anything to get a drink of water. And so I think there are lots of examples throughout medicine of these derangements, if you like, of volition. We just don't know about them. And we have to kind of constantly say, hey, this is a feature of human beings. We've known it for a long time. Addiction is just one iteration of this problem. So, now then we have to kind of look at the areas of the brain that do this, that actually put this capacity together, and there are various areas of the prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral, ventromedial, these other areas like the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the part of my brain that detects errors in the environment. So people who kind of look out over their environment and are able to pick up on social cues, and that helps them guide their behavior socially. That's the anterior cingulate cortex, all right? So one of the beliefs is that in ADHD patients, this isn't working as well, and so the social functioning of people with ADHD is just a little off, right? I like to think of this part of my brain as the part of my brain where I observe myself through your eyes, right? So I'm standing up here, giving this lecture. I've got a relatively good idea of how I'm doing. I am losing a couple people. I'm sorry. I've got some friends. Thank you. I appreciate that. I can do that. I can self-monitor in a social situation because I have this part of my brain. When I use drugs, I lose that. And so when you turn on that, this is the part of the brain that makes people with addiction such good television. So when you turn on that show, Intervention, right? And we all know the people in that show, they've saved many, many lives. But when we see that person act that way, that characteristic behavior, when that young man uses the F word with his 85-year-old grandmother, you're watching a person have a stroke, or at least a really, really bad TIA, but they're not losing their ability to speak or move. They're losing social cognition. They're losing this part of us that is just so important to who we are. And this is one of the areas of the brain that breaks, and this is why I need other anterior cingulate cortices in my life, other sober men in my life to help me recalibrate this, because I can't, even to this day, long sober, I still have these moments of poor social cognition. Insular cortex, interesting area of the brain, getting a lot more attention these days. It's coming because of this case series that was published by this guy, Dr. Nakvi. And Dr. Nakvi essentially was studying patients who had strokes in the insular cortex. And these patients in particular had been very severe smokers, 2-3 pack-a-day smokers. And the insular cortex is essentially what connects our conscious mind to our body. Our body is constantly getting signals from our gut, from our diaphragm, from all kinds of different neural systems bringing information up. And we're not typically conscious of it, right? But it can affect our emotions and it can affect our choices. And these patients who had strokes in the insular cortex, they essentially lost that capacity for enteroception, that ability to sense what my body is telling me, right? And have it become conscious. And so these smokers essentially just forgot to smoke. They just stopped smoking. They didn't even go through nicotine withdrawal. They just kind of stopped. And so the belief is that something is going wrong here, right? And that's what's disrupting their nicotine addiction. Now, don't take a knitting needle and try and jab it into your insular cortex and fix your addiction. It's not going to be that easy. But a lot of the somatic experiencing, mindfulness-based therapies, literally meditation, listening to what my body is telling me to try to fix that alexithymia, that inability to even name the emotion that I'm having right now. Am I craving or am I hungry? Am am I sad? Am I angry or am I sad, right? That helps people with their craving, right? The orbitofrontal cortex, I'm looking at the clock here, we'll be taking a break here in just a few minutes. So this is the value calculator in my brain. People who have strokes in this part of the brain, they look normal, but they have some interesting impairments, and one of them is they cannot guess the price of consumer objects correctly, right? They're terrible on the game show The Price is Right, right? And that seems like a small thing, but their entire emotional functioning falls apart. Because they can't calculate value correctly. So we often say that the orbitofrontal cortex is calculating value, and then as more information comes in, it updates that calculation, right? So let's say I wake up this morning and I say to myself, oh my God, I'm so glad to be sober. I never want to go back to what that was like. I want to stay sober. Drugs have very low value for me. I'm never going back. But then I don't eat breakfast, and I don't have lunch. And I get into a fight with my coworker, and someone shakes their fist at me or I at them on the 405 driving home. And then I miss my 6 p.m. meeting. As more and more information comes in, that value calculation will shift. And remember, as part of that value calculation, there is also a likelihood, probability calculation. So neuroscientists often call the orbitofrontal cortex a Bayesian calculator. Hey, I do not understand statistics very well, but again, Bayesian inference is a way of recalculating probabilities as more information comes in. So one way of thinking of Bayesian inference is to think about that game show, Let's Make a Deal. Remember that? When I was a kid, it was Monty Hall. I guess today it's Wayne Brady. But the basic show is the same. You're faced with this, choice of 3 doors. And behind one door, is a prize, right? Like that beautiful purple gremlin. Who doesn't want that, huh? And behind the other 2 is a joke, something you wouldn't want. In the parlance of the show, a zonk, a llama or a goat. And so Monty says, okay, which door would you like? And let's say in your mind you pick 2. You don't say anything, but you pick door number 2. And Monty or Wayne reveals what's behind door number 1. And it's a zonk. What Bayesian inference asks is this question: should you start over from scratch and remake your decision? And it's a little counterintuitive, but the answer is yes, because when I first made my decision, I had a 1 in 3 chance of being correct. Now I've got a 1 in 2 chance. And that change in probability is very, very important. So just imagine more and more information coming in and this probability calculation getting skewed or biased in favor of using drugs, right? So let's say I'm a sober alcoholic, or let this reprobate here, whoever that is, and I've got a choice between 3 things. One is going for a nice, motorcycle ride with my wife, and that has a certain value, and it's very likely. If I choose to do that, it'll happen. So a probability of 1, going to happen if I choose that. Second is, let's take a walk through the beautiful, fall colors of Vermont. All right, again, value, probability, very likely to happen. So 100% if I choose that. The third option is drinking, given that after that drink I go to jail, right? And so what happens in addiction is that people essentially overvalue future drug-related rewards and overestimate the probability that they will work out as intended, and undervalue the consequences that might result, and underestimate the probability that those consequences will in fact come true. And so as that information comes in, which is skewed, it will bend the choice towards outcome number 3, which is not the good outcome, right? Because I'm overvaluing the alcohol and undervaluing going back to jail. And this is essentially why people with addiction have such a troubled relationship with risk. When they're leaving treatment, when they're starting out in early sobriety, they literally cannot see the probability of error. Which is why, and I said this in my second film, which is why the science of safety, which is all about risk management, can be useful here, where I'm literally taking my thinking out of the game, and I'm doing things which essentially lock in my options not to drink. And so this is, I think this is very fascinating. We're starting to really, neuroeconomists are starting to be able to computer model choice in the brain. And essentially, as we stand on the threshold of a choice, we make those calculations. And what's happening in addiction is that those calculations are essentially getting biased or perverted. And each of these different areas of the brain handles a different component of choice making, right? Okay, any questions about that? Alrighty, I think it's a good time right now to take a 5-10 minute break, and then when we come back, I'll get into the meat of everything. All right, so I always start with this part because it helps families kind of see right away, this is what your loved one is going through, that incredible insensitivity, or if you like, what Tim and Cermak, the addiction medicine specialist in Marin County, former CSAM president, says, the acquired narcissism, if you like, of addiction, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek statement because, narcissistic personality disorders are not acquired. But when people are in these brain states, they absolutely look like they have a personality disorder. And I think that that's one of the things that is always kind of, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've always been I've chafed against the conflation of substance use disorder and cluster B access to personality disorders, because no one's been able to explain to me, how could you tell the difference between a person who really does have that access to diagnosis and a person who is in a brain state temporarily and will, with recovery, come out of it. But this is, I think, what helps a lot of families understand. This is why your previously very sensitive child is acting in ways that are so hurtful to the family. And I also think that especially opioid addicts, they think of themselves as very empathic. I think of them as really sweet people. You've probably heard me say this before. I think heroin addicts are really sweet people. They're exquisitely sensitive to the feelings of people around them. It's almost a capacity. In fact, George Krug came up with a word for it. He calls it hyperkadiophia. It is the residual emotional hypersensitivity that remains even after a person has been detoxed from opioids, lasts well into their first years, and maybe it's a capacity that they always had. So if you think of yourself as a very sensitive and empathic individual, and yet you're suddenly confronted with the gross insensitivity and failure of empathy of the behavior of addiction, I think that can almost cause a psychological crisis for some people when they see that. And I think what you've got is these areas of the brain are failing. So it's not so much that empathy is enhanced, it's that aspects of empathy are enhanced and other areas are failing, right? So that ability to put myself into the shoes of another person or to feel their pain, that goes up, which is what you would expect in a hyperalgesic state, whether it be physical pain or emotional pain. But that ability to see myself through that individual's eyes, that fails. And so I think what you've got you've got empathy breaking down more than necessarily an enhancement of empathy. And that's, I think, very tricky indeed to be able to walk a person through that. Okay, so now that we've talked about the frontal cortex, I'll come back down here and talk a little bit about genes. When we say that the addiction is a heritable disorder, we often use this term heritability. And what we mean by that is not that if I have a parent with alcoholism that I've got a 1 in 2 or 2 in 3 chance of becoming an alcoholic myself. What it means is that if I become an alcoholic, then 48 to 66% of the explanation of that can be attributed to my genes alone. And so these measures of heritability should never be applied necessarily to an individual. They're really statements about population, and they're statements about risk. They're not necessarily statements about what will happen. They're, again, probability statements. And I think that that's important because so many people who find themselves in treatment feel so guilty about the fact that they might pass on their addicted genes onto their beloved children. It helps them to understand that all this vulnerability, all this heritability is a vulnerability measurement. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And not only can the genes be passed along, but so too can the person's recovery. So there's at least a couple hundred of these genes, and they all kind of come on and off at different times. And they kind of, when you put them all together, they make up that they make up that person's overall vulnerability or resilience to addiction. So I talked about this gentleman's research in the movie. He's found that sons of alcoholics who are genetic low responders to alcohol are more likely to develop alcoholism as they progress into adulthood, right? So here's an example of a genetic low response to alcohol that creates the vulnerability. We also know that there's a genetic vulnerability with opioids. So if a person is prescribed opioids, even if it's for legitimate pain, and they have a hyper-euphoric response, it is that's not what most people feel. Most people get a little euphoria. Some people actually get dysphoria. But this experience, it rewrites this individual's life. I mean, they say, where has this been? I'm going to do this until the day I die. That hyper euphoric experience is associated with an increased risk. So some of these are low responses, and some of these are over responses, right? But there's literally hundreds of them, and they're all kind of coming together at different times. And some of them will directly affect the person's style of choice making, right? So here's a single base pair substitution. These are the holy grail of genetics. There are very few diseases that do this. Cystic fibrosis is one. Sickle cell anemia is one, where you just have one substitution, and that change, that polymorphism in this enzyme, COMT, which breaks down monoamine neurotransmitters like dopamine, right? It is associated with a decision-making style where people tend to make quicker decisions. They choose things, rewards that are more immediate over rewards that are better but delayed. And this is a phenomenon that we see in all human beings, right? This delayed discounting. We'd much rather have $5 now than $10 a year from now, even though $10 is twice the value. We tend to discount the reward depending on how far in the future it is. And some people do that a little bit, and some people do it a lot more, right? And at least in this one case, that decision-making style is genetic. It was in place before the person was born. Choice has nothing to do with this here, all right? So there's a number of these things. Where things get interesting, though, is when you look not at genetics, but at epigenetics, right? So epigenetics is a way of taking information in the present and sending it into the future. The most famous epigenetic study, the one that really began everything, it's called the Överkalix study. You can't quite see it, but that's a map of Sweden. And Överkalix is this tiny little town way in the northern part of Sweden, right up at the Arctic Circle. And what was noticed, and this town has very, very good records going back several hundred years. Let me see if that, well, kind of is there. What was noticed is that if a young boy, let's see, let me just. Let's do this. There we go. If a young boy, and it has to be at a particular window of development, 7 to 14 years of age, if a young boy is exposed, like the whole town of Överkalix, to food scarcity, let's say that the crops don't make it very well that summer, and the whole town that winter goes through the same stressor of food scarcity. If that young boy is exposed to food scarcity at that window of development, the rate of diabetes goes down, not in him, not in his son, but in his grandson. And if a young woman, again, same window of development, 7 to 14 years of age, if she's exposed to food scarcity, the rate of diabetes in her goes up, the rate of diabetes goes up, not in her daughter, but in her granddaughter, right? And so what this implies is that the stressors faced by one generation can have transgenerational impacts on disease expression. And so the statement that trauma is heritable, now there is actually a physical basis to that understanding. And so we can literally have a deeper grasp of these cases that we've known for a long time, like, for instance, that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have a higher rate of PTSD. Why would that be? Well, it has to do not with genetic changes, but with these epigenetic changes. They're not to the DNA itself, they're to the packaging of the DNA, right? And these stressors in the environment can create things like little methyl groups attached to the DNA methylation or DNA acetylation. And what does that do? Well, it produces just a little kink in the DNA, and that can affect how tightly the DNA is wrapped around these little histones, these little packaging hockey pucks, when the cell, when the DNA comes together in chromosomes for cell division. And if it's wrapped tightly, I can have the gene for a protein, but it's wrapped so tightly I can't actually turn it into a protein. But other changes leave the DNA very readily available to be turned into a protein. And that small difference right there can determine the difference of disease or no disease. And this is, usually when I do this for patients, they get kind of depressed at this point because they're like, oh my God, there's no way I'm going to, ever get better. I mean, and I passed all this on to my kid. I mean, for all I know, I could be dealing with the remnants of the Irish potato famine, right? Locked away in my genes. But the good news is that these epigenetic changes are reversible. And there are things that I can do that either produce beneficial epigenetic changes or actually erase the methylation. I read one study that associated a single instance of childhood mistreatment, child mistreatment, with a methylation at a very, very, very specific point on a specific chromosome, and that methylation was associated with an increased risk of bipolar disorder. So there really are mechanisms behind this, and they go in the bad direction, but they also go in the good direction. And I think that this is what leaves open the idea that maybe when a person gets into recovery, a lot of these bad changes are being erased or good changes are being put in their place. And so this is why I always try to make that point that, yeah, you'll pass on your genes, okay, we can't help that, but you can also pass on your recovery. All that parent's recovery is heritable as well. And if I had a magic wand and I could give one thing to every family in this country at this terrible, terrible time of opioid overdose deaths, it would be a family member in recovery, right? And so I tell our patients, I know you're here right now in treatment, and if you're anything like me, things look a little dark. When I came to treatment, people were pretty pissed off at me, and I had some family members who never wanted to speak to me again. Maybe that's your case too. I promise you this will happen. I don't know if it'll happen in a year or maybe 20 years from now, but you're going to get a call from that family member. And they're going to say to you, listen, I realize we've had our differences and we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I know that you went through this, and I know that you got sober. We just got a call from our kid's school. He's been kicked out for drugs. Can I ask you some questions? And that's the point at which that person's recovery becomes a resilience factor far beyond themselves, for their family, for their community, maybe even their country. And that's why I'm so excited about these collegiate recovery programs, because I think as bad as this epidemic gets, you can point to the collegiate recovery community movement and feel like there's hope. Because I really think it's folks like that are going to lead us out of this mess. Because I think recovery is more of a benefit than any family history can be a detriment. So none of us really know where the arc of our story will end, and certainly patients who've come to treatment are not going to be able to see it. When I was in prison, I thought that, that's it. I mean, I'm never going to be able to do a whole bunch of things like, how can I get married? How can I get married? How can I, look in the eyes of the woman that I love, or look into her parents' eyes and say, I can be a good, husband to you, being an ex-con, right? And with any kind of credibility. Well, it's funny how these things work out. I ended up marrying my 9th grade sweetheart, who had a bit of a fund of knowledge of me before I ever used drugs, believe it or not. And our parents have been trying to get us together our whole lives, and my mother even delivered 2 of her kids, and they finally succeeded. And last year, I took her youngest son, who my mother delivered, to New Zealand. I did a lecture for Air New Zealand, and he was sitting right in the front row as I told my sordid story, and to illustrate this fascinating neuroscience. I never would have thought that something like that was possible. how proud he is of me, how he, routinely brings me in to talk to his high school class about whatever's in the news. None of us know where this is going to end. That's what makes this such an amazing disease. I can't think of any disease where the lethality is so very real, and yet that can completely turn around when a person gets into recovery. And so that's why we are more than just our genes. Our genes are very important. Yes, we can't dismiss it, but this is just, one part of this, and I think recovery is more powerful than genes. Now, this is the part that I like, and this is what the part that patients like too. The component where we start to initiate a pleasurable experience. These are in the early reward structures of the brain, and they primarily use dopamine. I've had trouble with this part of the lecture and trying to help people understand that basically what the brain does is it's very good at identifying those things in the environment which are good for survival. And the way it does that is it attaches pleasure to them, right? And our brain basically gives more pleasure, or more hedonic, value to things that have more survival efficiency, right? Things like, chocolate cake, right? And people gripe at me, they're like, I don't like chocolate cake's terrible. All right, well, that's not the way the brain works, right? So the way the brain works is if you're on a desert island, all right, let's say you're on a desert island and 15 minutes you walk around the whole thing, you know every little bit of it, and there ain't no food. And you're in a very severe survival situation. You may starve. And a container washes up on the beach. What do you want to be in that container? Broccoli or chocolate cupcakes, right? I can tell you right now, that ain't gonna do shit, right? There is nothing of survival value in broccoli. And this is where I start to lose people. Like, people get really upset that I don't give more respect to broccoli, right? But let me tell you something. There's no caloric value in broccoli, okay? And people say, well, I like broccoli more than I like chocolate, cupcakes. That's because you have a really good frontal cortex. And it has essentially, overridden the part of your brain that likes chocolate cupcakes. And you have now created a metaphor out of broccoli, which is about health and longevity, and that's all great. But that's not the way the midbrain works. The midbrain gives greater value, and I think that most people that you would poll would say that chocolate cupcakes taste better than broccoli. But this has been the biggest complaint I've gotten out of the first film, so I want to be very, very careful. But I can tell you, that's great. If you like broccoli, terrific. But dogs don't steal broccoli. They steal cupcakes, right? And so see me after the lecture and we can fight this out. But that's the way this part of the brain works. And so if you go to the core of every pleasurable experience, what you'll find along this pathway of neurons, one of which starts in the midbrain, specifically the ventral tegmental area, the cell bodies there send their little axons up to this area called the dorsal striatum, let me just say the striatum, and the nucleus accumbens. Why am I torturing you with these names? Because it's very hard to read a New York Times article about addiction and not hear VTA and NA. So now you know that. This is the very first part of the brain that is active when it generates that yum, right? Lots of other chemicals, lots of other structures are going to take over, but that's the first, and those cells release the chemical that we've all heard of, right? Now remember, dopamine does not handle pleasure per se. It handles reward salience. It gets my attention. It zeroes me in. It tells me this is important for survival. And remember, my choice making is very much dependent upon my ability to correctly envision the future. And so if I think that something's going to be pretty good, and when I get to it, it's better than I thought, that's important. And that's what dopamine handles. It handles that reward prediction error of the calculation. So many of you have seen me do this. I'll do it one more time. If I'm standing at a vending machine and I want to buy a bag of Funyuns, all right? Let's say I'm a pot addict. No one can figure out the connection between pot and Funyuns. It's just one of those things we're going to have to accept about the world. And Funyuns cost $1, and I put in my dollar, and due to a freak of vending machine physics, I get 2 bags of Funyuns. That is when the brain releases dopamine, all right? So again, the brain was thinking, hey, we're gonna get 1, this is gonna be great. We got 2, now pay attention to this. This is really good for survival. Put this higher on the survival priority list. And so that's what dopamine handles. It allows us to recognize things that are good for survival, learn them, and then another future-oriented word, predict them, right? And so this is where Nora Volkoff's research was so important. She was able to find that it really mattered how much dopamine came on and how fast it came on that really created that calculation or skewed that calculation. And so we're used to, normal releases of dopamine. What drugs do is they create these artificial, superphysiologic spikes of dopamine, and that's the problem. And this is, I think, the one merciful thing that nature gave us, is that what all drugs of abuse, what all potentially addicting drugs do, is they create these spikes of dopamine, right? So this is the dopamine hypothesis. We understand immediately that, if I'm a cocaine addict and I want to stop cocaine, but I say, well, I've never had a problem with alcohol, I've got an issue, because if I start drinking alcohol, it's going to do much the same thing, and I'm going to have a high likelihood of relapsing to alcohol, right? And how many people say, oh, I need to get off heroin by moving over to a marijuana maintenance program, right? And I think, on some level, yes, you do get some benefits by moving over, but the intoxication is still there. You've still got that spike, and so the problem is still going to be, the problem is still there. Intoxication is still in the picture. Where things get tricky about this dopamine hypothesis is what it can tell us about mistakes that we're making in treatment today. And they include that drug right there. What I was told in treatment is don't make any big changes in the first year. And don't quit your job, don't try and quit smoking. It's too hard, you're gonna crave more, you're more likely to relapse. And what the research actually shows us is that that's all wrong. Is that people who continue to smoke in their first year after treatment report worse cravings and are more likely to relapse. And people who quit smoking in their first year after treatment are more likely to be sober from their primary drug 9 years later. So it's a huge protective factor to quit smoking, right? Take that spike out, and all of a sudden you've got a big benefit, right? Now that is not good news. This is where I really start to lose, a lot of the patients that I'm talking to, right? And it's very easy for me to be high-handed about smoking because I don't smoke, but it turns out, here's the other powerful thing about this dopamine hypothesis. It shows me all the other things that are not necessarily chemical that can also cause these spikes of dopamine. And so this is, I think, this is my oldest and most famous slide because it shows most of what's up there, right? And I have a lot of sympathy for my brothers and sisters who continue to smoke because I got a problem that is just as bad and just as dangerous with sugar. And I'm telling you, the problem is bad. It is going to be touch and go tonight in my hotel room as to whether or not I drive away at midnight and get a giant Slurpee, all right? I have struggled with this my entire life. This is what life is like in recovery, and they all basically do the same thing. They increase dopamine in this pathway from the VTA to the NA. Some do it directly there. So cocaine and methamphetamine have no middleman. So if you're a crystal or crack smoker, congratulate yourself. You've eliminated the middleman. The others work through a back door. And if you could put a third layer here, then you'd be able to account for these here, especially highly ritualized, rule-based reinforcers like gambling. Yes, sir. He's got a microphone for you.
Oh, thanks.
It's a little scary, isn't it? Yeah.
Hi. Would you please more explain about the cults part, please?
Yeah, so I think, okay, here's how I made this list. I went to the Lowenson text, all right? That's the main textbook for addiction medicine. And if you open up the table of contents, it basically lists those things. And so there was a chapter on cults, and so I put it in there. And yes, I do think that there is a mood alteration that goes on in people who are part of ritualistic cults. And I think that their thinking is just as impaired, and I think that they receive certain structures of reinforcement that would put them in league with their other process-addicted individuals. What's interesting about this list is that a lot of these things, if done normally, are perfectly healthy. They're good. In fact, they're good for recovery. So developing a spiritual life, practicing my faith, right? That's fine. It's when I take that thing and I overdrive it, when I create a caricature of what the original behavior was, that's where I'm in trouble. That's where I'm mood altering, right? So we're not talking about exercise, right? When we talk about people who have exercise addictions, we're not talking about healthy exercise. This is why you will not find a stair stepper in most eating disorder programs, because people aren't exercising. They're exercising through injury. They're on this thing for hours and hours at a time. That's where we start to get into problems. They've managed to tease out that little bit of reinforcement, that euphoria perhaps, and maybe it's opioid based, but that then has a connection to dopamine, and that's why it's problematic. So any of these things could go off the reservation, so to speak, and really it's the manipulation of a pleasurable experience to cope with stress. That's the initial problem that can get me into addiction. And so that's why I like this slide, is that it kind of forces us to look at a lot of these other things. If you look at Heyman's book, Addiction is a Disease of Choice, a lot of his chapters are based on heroin addiction. But he never takes a step back and looks at all of the other things, right? Maybe all those heroin addicts who spontaneously remitted just moved over to alcohol or moved over to something else. What I like this slide for is that it really gives me the full breadth of the problem. Did I answer your question? Yes. Good. Was there, I thought I saw another, okay, good, all right. So where we see the problem, and this is, I think, what Dr. Silkworth was always getting at, I think that somehow these people might be different from the normal drinker. Here's the difference. It's in these receptors for dopamine. And so this is what Nora was able to point out, is that these patients have too few of this particular kind of dopamine receptor in these reward structures of the brain, right? So this is the person who is currently using, this is the person who is newly sober. And we're trying to get back to here, and I think most of us do go back to there, but maybe we go most of the way. And what's the difference? Well, that could be adult ADHD, because ADHD is also too few dopamine receptors, and it's the number of those receptors that drives proper signaling up to those critical areas of the frontal cortex. If I have enough of them, great. My orbitofrontal cortex works well, and my calculations are correct, and my decision-making is good, and maybe even my self-awareness is improved. But if I have too few, those things will suffer. And so I don't want to hear this, but I need to. My behavior with sugar is a potential risk to my overall sobriety. It may degrade my decision-making. It may even degrade my ability to function correctly in my relationships, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we have to pay attention to. In fact, I think, the drug that is most likely to kill your patients and my patients is not heroin or alcohol or meth. It's nicotine, right? If I'm not careful, I will die from my addiction. I won't die from cocaine or opioids, but I will succumb to this problem if I can't get a handle on it. Yes, ma'am.
Is the deficit in D2 receptors from endocytosis, or is it just a genetic?
I think it could be both. So the question is the deficit from endocytosis, or is it genetic? In other words, was this a problem that was triggered by the drug use and the receptors were taken back into the cell, right? And there's quite a bit of trafficking that goes on. It's really quite interesting. The receptor's taken into the cell, it's altered, and then represented. And this is why I like to think that there's really, even though heroin is roughly the same from time to time, it's never quite the same. And that's because the entire population of my opioid receptors is shifting, and it's doing it by microsecond to microsecond to microsecond. So the famous pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, he said, you can never stand in the same river twice. And I kind of think that way about intoxication too, is I can never really dip my foot into the same heroin river twice, because each time it changes a little bit. And this is one of the things that helped me stop cocaine. Because one of the things that I noticed is if I relapsed to cocaine, the first dose was big, and then very quickly it dropped off. And that's the power of that endocytosis. The brain just removing those receptors very, very globally and very, very quickly. And so I used to sit there and go, why doesn't this work? Why doesn't this work? And every now and then I'd get a really big dose on board and it would work, but for the most part, the amount that got me high just 10 minutes before would not anymore. And so part of it is endocytosis, but part of it could be a pre-existing problem with these dopamine receptors to begin with. And so this would be the reward deficiency syndrome, right? That these people were never quite where normal people are. And maybe that's also ADHD too. And so but I think whatever the reason is, I need to understand that my receptors are fragile. I need to take care of them. And if I don't, then I'm going to continue to have these problems, right? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. In terms of the relationship between nicotine and predictability of success with other addictions, would it matter if the nicotine was stopped immediately or if you used like a patch or some sort of other titration program within the first 30 days or a year?
Yeah, all the studies that I know, and Elizabeth Stoit, I can't remember, I think she's from Minnesota, University of Minnesota, and I can send you those papers. I got a little, folder of all her papers. Those patients were on nicotine replacement therapy who did well. So again, what's the idea of nicotine replacement therapy? It's to try to take out, here we go, the spike, right? So nicotine replacement therapy isn't this, it's this, right? And so, it's on board, the person isn't going into withdrawal. Varenicline, same thing. I think of varenicline as the Suboxone for nicotine, right? It's no intoxication, but you still have receptor binding, right? But if a person is smoking or they're vaping or something like that, you're getting that very powerful delivery, and it's the spike that's the danger. So if that person can move over to nicotine replacement therapy or varenicline or something like that as a stage to get to abstinence, that would count. That would count. It's the intoxication that's the problem. And even if it's sugar, bad news for me, right? So, I like to use this to kind of help to help parents understand. Usually when I do a family program, there's usually some chaos that occurs just before the family's airplane lands at LAX, and there's almost always a family whose kid has left treatment. And so I really try and help them, look at the world through their eyes, right? So let me change my metaphor a little bit here from Funyuns to gumballs, all right? Let's say that this is a real gumball machine in reality, and I want to buy a yellow gumball, okay? Now, just looking at it, what do you think my chance would be with any 1/4 of getting a yellow gumball? Yeah, to me it looks about 1 out of 10. So I got about a 1 in 10 chance with any 1/4 of getting a yellow gumball. Now fix that probability in your mind, 10%. It's not going to change. It's reality. But with this person who is on the threshold of leaving treatment, right, they saw the world differently than what you and I do, right? Because they've been putting quarters into the gumball machine, getting 2 gumballs, getting that surge of dopamine along that pathway of neurons, one of which runs right into the orbital frontal cortex, the part of the brain that calculates this value. And so they don't see what you and I see, 10%. They see 20%. They see 33%. They see 100%. And that's what that surge of dopamine does. It just crowds out every other possibility. And so in their mind, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to leave here and it's going to be great. I'm going to get the guy on the phone. I'm going to have the money. He's going to have the really good stuff. I'm going to get to the hotel room. I'm going to find a vein. It's going to be terrific. And what really happens is they leave treatment and within a couple hours, they're sitting on a block of cement at the local police department, right? So this is exactly what happened with me. I escaped Rancho La Brea. This is before Leavenworth. I escaped Rancho La Brea, came up here to Torrance to use drugs. Sorry. And 2 days later was tackled in Redondo Beach, absolutely psychotic. And in my mind, I was thinking, absolutely in the short term, and that everything's going to be great. And this is the way human will collapses. We lose our ability to envision the future correctly. And that is a terrible, terrible, awful disability. Because what the prosecutor will see is that you got out of treatment, you got the guy on the phone, you got across town, you had the money. All that procedural memory was still intact. None of this disturbs that procedural memory. So that linking those ideas, getting from one place to another, that's not a problem. But the actual ability to say, if I leave treatment, I'm going to go back to jail. It's going to be miserable. Remember what happened last time? I was psychotic. I'm going to be, wrestled to the ground by the Redondo Beach Police Department. I don't see any of that. And so what the prosecutor will do is, I think, make the error of seeing in the procedural memory criminal intent. They will see mens rea when in fact it did not really exist to the degree that we want it to when we have a real criminal conviction. And that is, I think, the power of this neuroscience, is that we can now start to take it into the courtroom and really start to, and this is very scary, it scares me too, but I don't think in the long run we will have a diminished understanding of choice. I think we'll have a deepened understanding of choice, a greater appreciation of how this actually works. So, you've probably seen this before. I was trying to kind of make this part of the lecture go a little faster, and then one day I was looking at this thing from chemistry, and I made up this periodic table of the intoxicants. So these are all the intoxicants. They change every few years, so if you've got any additions, let me know. We've got them laminated. Makes a great placemat for the kids. So. Oh, they're free to you. They're free to you. So you just go ahead and email me. I'll have whoever wants these at the end. Here, Trish, you've always been such a great friend. And any parent who has a child in treatment, they're welcome to the other one. And I'll be more than happy to send you a high definition PDF. And so it's just a kind of shorthand to help people understand that yeah, you might be an opioid person, or you might be a sedative hypnotic person, or a cocaine guy. But the fact is that if I'm recovering from cocaine and I'm having insomnia, my addiction medicine specialist is not going to prescribe me Ambien, right? Because they all do the same thing, right? And so even though some fit into certain classes, they all end at the dopamine system. And then, of course, the process addictions are down here. And here's that woman, Stoit, at the University of Colorado, right? And so she's got these series of papers that really kind of take on that shibboleth of, don't try to quit smoking in treatment. And I think that's something that the future will not remember us well for if we don't get a handle on this. I'm not saying that this is true. This is just a speculation. But what if a third of all post-inpatient treatment heroin relapse is the smoking? I don't have any numbers to back that up, but what if it is? Like I said, future workers in this field will not think of us very kindly, that's for sure, if we didn't deal with this. And I don't come to this table free of sin myself. So this is kind of, the thing to do for this part of addiction is, take out the spikes. And then, and this is important, put normal dopamine releasers back into the picture, because these releases of dopamine, normal rewards, not a problem. So there's a difference between fruit and Fruit Loops, all right? Fruit is good. Have all the fruit you want. Fruit Loops, something very different, right? And so this is what the authors of the Blueprint studies would situate in the first stage of addiction. It's all about pleasure. It's all about in these areas of the brain. It's all about dopamine. And so this is where things start out. And most people stay here, but there are some people who continue to use, and then they move into the second stage. By the way, this is where this Rat Park study comes in. Remember I mentioned that TED Talk about Rat Park, and this was done by this Canadian different Canadian. I don't know what's going on with Canada these days, but Bruce Alexander did this study, and what he showed is that if you just put a rat in a Skinner box and give him a lever to press for heroin, he's going to get addicted very quickly. But if you put him into a nice cage, right, with shavings and toys and good food and other rats to play with, and when I say play, I don't mean checkers, all right? Those rats don't become addicted to heroin. And if you take the heroin-addicted rat and put him into Rat Park, he stops using heroin. right? And so the idea is that it's not the drugs. It's not the drugs that are creating the addiction. It's the environment, right? And if you provide a good enough environment, then addiction won't happen, which is, I guess, the reason why no rich person ever became addicted to anything ever, right? But if you have a stronger understanding of dopamine, then you can see, well, okay, he stopped heroin, but did he move over to something else, right? What was available, right? So you can't really tell if the addiction stopped. And if you go back and you really read Alexander's study, both groups drank plenty of morphine. It's not like morphine just went away. And you know, plenty of rats died in the socially housed group, right? So I think you know, the basic message here is that housing matters, and I believe that. That's why I've worked so, you know, why I picked sober living to you know, plant my flag. But it's very, very hard to nail down if the addiction stopped or not. And that's why I say I don't think anyone really knows what's happening with these people. We really have to have much, much more granular understanding of whether they're sober or not, or how the addiction might be moving around. Dopamine, though, very quickly begins to fade in its ability to create pleasure, create reward, and it quickly becomes a chemical more of laying down cues, right? Which is why you see this very sinister change where the salience of the drug goes up, but the actual pleasure that it gives goes down. So the drive increases, but the actual satisfaction, you know, doesn't, which I think explains cocaine perfectly, all right? And cocaine is one of those drugs that works on dopamine, not exclusively, but on dopamine in particular, right? But very quickly things move over to the cue system. So this is the second part of the reward learning system, the learning part. And this involves the chemical that comes right after dopamine, which is called glutamate. And what a normal release of dopamine from a normal pleasure will do is release a normal amount of glutamate, and that normal amount of glutamate just creates a memory of whatever released the normal amount of dopamine. But because intoxication involves such big surges of dopamine, you get an equal response from the glutamate system, and that doesn't just create a memory of the drug, it really burns the drug into memory. It creates this drug hyper memory. And so now, this is actually supposed to be up there, sorry, this slide is wrong. Now we're in the areas of the brain that are important in laying down memory. So this is the hippocampus, this is the amygdala, which gives that first coding of affect to the signal as it goes up. I don't believe that the brain can tell the difference between intoxication and trauma until the signal gets to the amygdala. That's where you start to get valence in one direction or another, aversive or pleasurable, right? And so now we have to look at this next group of areas, this next area of the brain, but we also have to pay more and more attention to the connections between them, right? The actual wiring, not the gray matter, but the white matter, and how that might change. And there is a new form of magnetic resonance imaging that can actually measure the wiring, right? So this is a picture, if you didn't take this earlier today, of the 405 at night. And what you're looking at are cars coming towards you and cars going away from you, and they're in a line because they're constrained by the structure of the Interstate 405. What DTI measures is movement of water molecules through the brain. And so you can get these extremely beautiful pictures of the actual wiring of the brain. And so, you know, you remember the Human Genome Project. That was the idea of what is the basic, you know, structure of all human DNA. Now the Connectome Project is trying to figure out what is the basic wiring diagram of the brain, because if we have that basic diagram, we could scan this person's brain and compare it and see if there's a difference, and that difference could be, in fact, disease. And this is purported to be PTSD. There's way too much signaling going through the amygdala up to the prefrontal cortex. There should be some, but not that much. And this is exciting because this may be the way that we actually assess through imaging whether a person has addiction or not, and how their treatment is going. As we give them serial DTI scans, we might be able to see this rewire, because again, that's the good news. The brain is very, very good at changing this wiring, the plastic changes that can go along with recovery. So we have these two systems. One is an impulsive dopamine system going up, and then normally the glutamate system comes back down and vetoes whatever the dopamine system says if it's not good. But what happens in addiction is this becomes too strong and this becomes too weak. So you've got way too much of the impulsive signal, right, and not enough of the inhibitory signal. And this is why you can see these extremely powerful reflexive relapses where the normal top-down control of the frontal cortex over these areas of the brain fails because there's way too much salience and way too much drive from memory, and the signal from the frontal cortex is weakening. So this is, I think, where Mark Lewis's argument comes in. He I think, has made an extremely good argument, which is addiction's not a disease, because really what you're looking at when you look at addiction is just a normal learning process in the brain. This is just what the brain does. It's an extreme form of learning, but until you can tell the difference between the kind of learning that goes on when we learn, say, the alphabet, and the kind of learning that goes on in addiction, you really can't say that this is pathology, right? Just because Nora sees different colors on her scans doesn't necessarily mean that's pathologic. Maybe that's just what the brain does. And perhaps it's better to think of addiction as sort of a stage through which the person is passing to a better stage and so it's wrong to say that they're in recovery because they're not really recovering from anything. And so Lewis, when he drew that line in the sand, unless you can tell the difference between, pathologic learning and normal learning in addiction, he kind of, set himself up, because Peter Kalivas at the Medical University of South Carolina did that decades ago. And so what Kalivas noticed is that there's so much glutamate out there that goes along with the intoxication that it starts to spill out of the synapse. And it's actually spilling out and binding to extrasynaptic receptors and creating these pathologically strong connections that normally wouldn't be there. And so this is really an over-learning process, a pathology of learning. And you can actually see that happening. When we learn something, we create these little dendritic spines. So when we learned the alphabet, you and me, we did this. But what's happening in people with addiction is that they're doing this far too strongly, far too intensely, and there's a lot of the chemicals left over from learning in greater amounts than there should be. And so this is why I think we can say that this is where these cues come from, and they are a pathologic form of memory, right? Which is why even today, when I come back to beautiful Southern California, I have these weird habits. I never drive on the I-5, never. I do not need to go by the Harbor Boulevard exit in East Anaheim. We won't get into why. I just don't need to go there. And so I will drive out of my way, the 22, the 405, everything I can do just to avoid the 5, right? Because there was a time where to merely drive by this exit was to take my sobriety in my hands. We have a tendency to undervalue or underestimate the power of these cues to trigger relapse. And today I'm sure I could do it. Matterhorn could go by. If something was on NPR that was interesting, I wouldn't even think about it. But I might. And so those memories never quite go away. They fade in their power. They don't guide behavior as much anymore, but they're always there. And that's what produces that enduring tendency to relapse. So again, if you look at the ASAM definition, the 3 things that cause relapse are any brief exposure to anything that creates large amounts of dopamine, exposure to cues that's mediated by glutamate, and then the third thing was exposure to stress. Again, sorry, this is the wrong slide. That should be highlighted, not that. And so now we're moving into this second phase of addiction, which is really mediated not by pleasure per se. It's mediated by all the chemicals that push back against pleasure that are aversive. Things like corticotropin releasing factor or aversive opioids like dynorphin that the brain releases, right? So when we talk about stress, the kind of stress that we're talking about is not the good stress that we deal with and achieve mastery. We're talking about stress that comes on and the person doesn't know how to manage it, and it just stays elevated. And so this is where George Koob's work comes in. He's on the short list for a Nobel Prize. He noticed and many others did too, that if you give a laboratory animal a reinforcer, that animal will use more of it over time. And what that implies is that something must be pushing back. There must be an opponent process to the reward process created by the reinforcer. And what's pushing back is the stress system. And so Koob does not call the stress system, he calls it the anti-reward system. Because when we get intoxicated and release dopamine, what the brain pushes back with is the stress hormone CRF. And those chemicals work against each other, kind of around a little bit of a pleasure set point. And if I get drunk, right, drinking binge, I push myself up into positive hedonic territory, right? Yay, feels good. But my brain says, whoa, 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 that's too high. So it pushes back with CRF to get it back to normal. Well, unfortunately, the CRF lasts longer than the beer. And so I spend a little time in negative hedonic territory, and that's the hangover. And if it's just one drinking binge, no harm, no foul, everything goes right back to homeostasis. But if I get drunk, the system goes up into positive hedonic territory, and when it comes down into negative hedonic territory, it doesn't quite come back all the way right away. The system has hysteresis. So the stress system, it's kind of like a slinky. Remember slinkies when you were a kid? And we go back and forth, and then, maybe one of the rings got a little bent, and then the slinky would never quite go back. That's the way the stress system works too. If it's overstretched, it doesn't quite go back. And so if I then become intoxicated on top of that lag there, I will go back up into positive hedonic territory, but not quite as far. And then my brain will push back, as it usually does, and I'll go a little deeper. And if I then get intoxicated on top of that, again, hair of the dog every time. If I'm getting intoxicated on a daily basis, what happens is that this just kind of moves from a situation of drinking to feel good, positive reinforcement, to drinking to just stave off the misery of all that stress hormone, negative reinforcement. And now what's motivating my continued drinking is not pleasure, but the avoidance of misery. And so if I keep on drinking and my brain is constantly spitting out all this stress hormone, eventually the system gets stuck. It just never really gets a chance to go back into its normality. And so the brain is constantly spitting out these stress hormones, and the normal negative feedback loop that would shut itself off, it just fades. And another way of looking at this is these dopamine receptors are downregulated, right? And that's what creates this blunting of my ability to feel normal pleasure. So now drug use itself is degrading my dopamine system, and that, of course, is going to degrade the functioning of my frontal cortex, right? So strategies to deal with this can be as basic as ensuring safe housing, and that's why I've always been a believer that really throughout medicine, you can have the best treatment in the world for diabetes, but if that patient who's diabetic doesn't live in a safe situation, it won't work as well. It may not work at all. And that's true for all chronic diseases and all treatments. Housing is such an important health determinant that once you have that, everything else works better. If you don't have it, then that Suboxone is not going to work. And I would even wager that if you don't have that, then maybe 12-step recovery won't work as well. And so that's why I'm such a big believer that everything else works better if you can just make sure that people have access to safe, sober, affordable housing. Yes, sir?
Is it similar to Rat Park?
I think so. I think the good things that are in Rat Park, and so this is where Rudolf Moose at Stanford University, his research comes in, and he's actually looked at the people who live in these houses and are doing well. And what you see are people who are living under the same roof. They're all supporting each other. They all know each other. They're all holding to the norms of recovery, right? So I can't walk into that house with a big, bottle of Benadryl and say, I'm going to get some sleep tonight. That's not going to work, all right? I'm looking at other people, right? There's quite a bit of modeling going on of good recovery, right? And if I come home and my probation officer has been a dick to me, the other people in the house will go, dude, this is just what we go through. You're going to be fine. So there's a whole multi-level ways of supporting that person's recovery and managing stress. And so, yeah, that's why I mean housing matters. And if you don't provide that, then you're in a Skinner box. And quite frankly, if you're in jail, it's an actual Skinner box. So I think this is an important area of all of this research, and it allows us to bring in the adverse childhood experiences study. It allows us to bring in the famous Vietnam vet study, which is often quoted in these arguments against addiction being a disease. Lee Robbins was one of the first psychiatric epidemiologists at Harvard. And just before she died, she wrote a letter saying, hey, people are misreading my study. What I noticed is that people who were using heroin in Vietnam, when they came back, they got better. We never thought that was possible. We didn't think that heroin addicts ever got better. We thought that it was just a death sentence and they were just, dead people walking. Well, that's what was amazing about my study, not necessarily that they used heroin in a stressful situation and then came back and stopped. And then the other thing is you don't really know what happened with those. They stopped heroin, great, but did they start drinking alcohol? I grew up in Alameda, California. I remember what 1971 was like in Alameda, California, which was the coming home spot, Naval Air Station Alameda, for people coming back from Vietnam. I can tell you right now, that place was an outrageous and dangerous party. And so drug use didn't just stop, it just probably migrated. But if we look at population psychiatry, we can find some studies, I think, that really kind of highlight what's actually happening here. So this guy, Sandro Galea, he's sort of the modern Lee Robbins. And he looks at how mental illness moves, not through individuals, but through entire populations. And a couple of his studies have looked at the likelihood of PTSD relative to your distance from the World Trade Center site in the 5 boroughs of New York. And what he found is that there were lots of people who were very close to the World Trade Center site, exposed to the trauma, but only a certain number of them actually got PTSD. There were certain people who were vulnerable. There were certain people who were not vulnerable at all. They were almost entirely resilient, right? Then for the people who were further away from the trauma, some of those still got PTSD, although most people did not, right? And in his study, he kind of points to these different pathways in and out of PTSD. And again, here we have this life course idea of the psychiatric illness, is that you have varying levels of vulnerability and different trajectories out of or through the disease. And I think that this is what explains why some people are getting better and why others are not. So I think, again, sometimes to find the answer, you have to just kind of look from 50,000 feet. And when you look at populations, then a lot of these arguments against addiction being a disease start to show their holes, right? So we kind of went through all of these at this point. Any questions about the arguments against addiction being a disease? Okay. So we're coming to the end here. So we've already talked a little bit about these structures of the brain that fail. Remember, we started off getting high, then we're using drugs just to feel normal, and then the third stage is where the brain actually sort of hardens the behavior. It just sort of clicks in there and makes sure that the person keeps on doing it. The cycle doesn't stop, and a lot of that can be actual changes to cognition, right? So the valuation part of the brain fails, and we overvalue the drug relative to things that deep down we truly feel are valuable. But in that moment, the drug has overwhelming value relative to other things. We lose social cognition. My behavior becomes extremely inflexible. I cannot see the opinions of other people. This is an ugly, ugly symptom. You've seen it. I've seen it. I typically see it when a mother is begging her son to stay in treatment. Tears are rolling down her face. Please stay in treatment. Why won't you stay? Do it for me. Just one more week. And the kid's like, nope, I'm not even having this conversation. I'm getting out of here. He gets up and walks out. And you look at it and you think sociopath, right? That must be what's going on here, right? But it's different. It's a brain state. It's not the same thing as the person's character, right? And in that state, decision making is terrible, right? They're making fast, very risky, poorly thought out decisions. Everything is a crisis. They're going from fun thing to fun thing, cannot tolerate boredom. And I think the reason we have trouble with that is that they're using the word boredom to really describe dysphoria. It's a sudden collapse of the opioid system that they're trying to escape. The emotions that they express are way out of proportion to whatever insult they're facing. They might not even be able to name the actual emotion, right? That's alexithymia. They're really good at getting jobs. They're terrible at keeping jobs, right? And so this is what you and I deal with. And when the rest of the world runs for the hills, we have the ability to stay with these patients. We know how to speak with them. We know how to preserve their dignity, because we understand this is not who the person is, this is the disease. We can separate those two, and that's a very, I think, important skill, especially in today's day and age. So the strategies to deal with this part of addiction are the second film, really the science of recovery management. That's a lecture for another time, but I think we all are either living it in our daily lives or helping other people find their way into that high quality recovery management. But the good news is that most people do get better with time. That's what's so mysterious about this. You can have the disease and be in very, very dangerous territory mortality-wise, but getting into sobriety, there's just a whole bunch of rewards that come along. And that's why I always like to quote my old friend, Dr. Joe Persh, we don't just get well, we get weller than well. And that was one of the first things he said to me. I hadn't even gone to Leavenworth yet. It always stayed with me. So we're back here at the ASAM definition. I think we've talked about everything. Does anyone have any final questions before we finish? Lots of phones going up, but all right. Well,
Thank
listen.
you to Dr. McCauley for a great lecture.